In the name of Allah, the most beneficent and the most merciful. My dear students, I welcome you to the fourth lecture of research methodology. In this lecture, we are going to study about formulating the research hypothesis. When we are studying about formulating hypothesis, the first thing which we have to understand is what actually the hypothesis is. Hypothesis begins with an assumption, means it's a kind of assumption. Researcher starts his study, his research from a new assumption. He assumes an aspect and later starts his study to test that hypothesis, to test that assumption, whether it is correct or incorrect. A hypothesis is really a temporary explanation, a kind of educated guess about what will happen under certain conditions. So, hypothesis is actually a temporary explanation because something is hypothesized, something is assumed before conducting a research, before starting a research study. Things are assumed. We can also call it an educated guess because researcher uses his common sense and assumes something, assumes the results of something and wants to test it. For example, a teacher or a researcher wants to test a technique or strategy for improving students' listening skills or speaking skills. What he would do, he would assume a situation. Say, for example, he wants to test a new technique, a new strategy, which he thinks is very helpful in teaching and learning. He would conduct an experimental study to test that hypothesis. First, he would formulate hypothesis. There would be null hypothesis as well as H1. We would be discussing about the null hypothesis and other kinds of hypothesis later on in this lecture. Excuse me. Here are some examples how we can hypothesize or how do we formulate hypothesis. For example, question is, do plants need light to grow? An example of hypothesis is, if green plants need light to grow, then only plants kept in light will display growth. Most of the time it is an if and then statement. It may or may not be if and that then statement. It can also be a simple statement. Say, for example, you want to check that smartphones play an important role in improving students' listening skills or not, then you would formulate hypothesis like there would be a null hypothesis which shows no effect. It would be like smartphone does not play any role in improving students' listening skills, and there would be a positive hypothesis that would be smartphone plays an important role in improving students' listening skills. In this way, we would formulate hypothesis for our study. Here are some other examples. Do living things give off CO2 when they digest food? A scientist thinks that living things give off carbon dioxide as they break down food. He predicts that carbon dioxide can be detected as an organism digests food. So, there would be a research question and a corresponding hypothesis. Say, for example, we take an example from linguistics or language teaching. We would repeat the same example which we are studying. If the research question is, does the use of smartphone play an important role in improving students' listening skills? Then the hypothesis would be smartphone plays an important role in improving students' listening skills, and other would be the use of smartphone does not help in improving students' listening skills. So, if there is a research question, it would also have the corresponding hypothesis. In the end, those hypotheses would be tested as right or wrong, or we would select that is the null hypothesis correct or is the positive hypothesis correct. What is hypothesis testing? A set of logical and statistical guidelines used to make decisions for sample statistics to population characteristics. When we have conducted the research, we have collected the data, we have analyzed the data, and we have drawn findings and conclusion. On the basis of those findings, we have to test the hypothesis. We have to accept a hypothesis as well as we have to reject the hypothesis. When we draw conclusions or get findings, then we are, according to the statistics, we are able to test the hypothesis. We are able to accept or reject the hypothesis of no effect or positive effect. If the positive effect hypothesis is accepted, then the null hypothesis of no effect will be rejected. If the null hypothesis is accepted, then the positive effect hypothesis would be rejected. Hypothesis testing. The intent of hypothesis testing is to formally examine two opposing conjectures or hypotheses at 0, that is null hypothesis of no effect, and HA or H1, that is of positive effect. These two hypotheses are mutually exclusive and exhaustive. Sample information is collected and analyzed. These two hypotheses are the opposite hypotheses to one another. And they are accepted or rejected after data collection and data analysis. Let's have a look on basic concepts in hypothesis testing. Null hypothesis and alternate hypothesis. I have already explained null hypothesis is the hypothesis which shows no effect of one strategy used for improving some skill. And alternate hypothesis is the hypothesis of positive effect. I have already given the examples of null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis. Level of significance. We have to analyze the level of its significance. Critical region, decision rule or test of hypothesis. These points we are going to study further in the lecture. And after that there will be type 1 and type 2 errors. These errors we are not going to study. What is null hypothesis? Specific statement about a population parameter made for the purpose of argument. It is always about a population parameter, not about a sample statistic. Null hypothesis shows no effect. Say for example, you want to test a new technique and you think that it's very effective or it is not effective for improving students' language skills, then null hypothesis would be the hypothesis which says that this strategy does not help in improving students' language skills. And alternate hypothesis represents all other possible parameters, values except that stated in the null hypothesis. And this alternate hypothesis is denoted by H1 or HA, and null hypothesis is denoted by H0. So it shows the positive effect as we have an alternate hypothesis with the null hypothesis in research. Because when we conduct a study, at the end of the study, when we draw conclusion and findings, there would be some effects of using one technique on students' learning, or there will be no effect. So null hypothesis would be accepted and alternate would be rejected, or vice versa. Level of significance. Now let's try to understand what is the level of significance in testing the hypothesis. The critical probability in choosing between the null and alternative hypothesis. So it's a critical probability in choosing between the null and alternative hypothesis. The researcher has to decide at the end, when he has drawn conclusion and findings, he has to decide whether the null hypothesis is correct or the alternative hypothesis is correct. The higher the significance level, the higher the probability of rejecting a null hypothesis when it's true. Significance level is a percentage or decimal value that tells how confident a researcher can be about being correct. So confidence level of the researcher would be measured through a percentage or decimal value. What is critical region? The acceptance and rejection region is called the critical region. If the value of mean falls within the rejection region, the null hypothesis is rejected. We have to measure the results in mean score or in percentage, and according to the results, we have to accept or reject null or alternative hypothesis. What is decision rule? Test of hypothesis. While testing the hypothesis, there is decision rule, the rule according to which we accept or reject null hypothesis. We as researchers have some rules already set, and we follow them while accepting or rejecting the null hypothesis. We have to look at the results. If the results fall more in favor of null hypothesis, then it would be accepted. If the results are in favor of alternate hypothesis, then the alternate hypothesis would be accepted as correct and the other would be rejected. Now let's have a look on the types of hypotheses which are used in research. First is descriptive hypothesis. It is formulated to describe characteristics. This type of hypothesis is used when we are trying to describe the characteristics or qualities of something. Say, for example, we want to analyze motivation. What are the major characteristics or qualities of motivation? Then we would use descriptive hypothesis because we want to describe different characteristics of motivation. And second type of hypothesis is relational hypothesis. They indicate the relationship between two variables. Say for example, in the last lecture we took the example of incentive and motivation. If we want to measure or analyze the relationship between these two variables, incentives and motivation, then we would use a relational hypothesis so that we may be able to check the relation between both variables. We have to see if any kind of relationship, positive or negative, or any other kind of relationship is present in between those two variables or not. Whether if the incentives are increased, the motivation is increased or not. What is the relationship between both variables? If we formulate such type of hypothesis to check the relation between two variables, it would be called the relational hypothesis. And the third type of hypothesis is the explanatory hypothesis. They guide about the cause and effect relationship between two variables. If we want to analyze the cause and effect relationship between two variables, then we would use the explanatory hypothesis. Say for example, we want to analyze the cause and effect relationship between incentives and motivation, that how incentives are increased and how does it influence the motivation level. So this type of hypothesis is called the explanatory hypothesis, which we use in research to check the cause and effect relationship between the two variables. Null hypothesis I have already explained. Null hypothesis is denoted by H0. It is a general statement or default position that there is no relationship between two measured phenomena or no association among groups. So it shows that there is no relationship between, say for example, the between incentives, increasing incentives and increased motivation, or using one strategy for language learning or teaching and students' achievement. So there is no relationship between, if there is no relationship between the two variables, by changing one variable other is not changed, then it would be a null hypothesis. And the alternate hypothesis is HA or H1, is the hypothesis that sample observations are influenced by some non-random cause. It is contrary to the null hypothesis. It is opposite to the null hypothesis because it shows that there is some relationship between both variables. For example, if we increase the incentive of workers, then their motivation level will be increased. There is a positive relationship between increasing incentives and increased motivation. This is alternative hypothesis. And we say that this hypothesis is the hypothesis that sample observations are influenced by some non-random cause. So it is contrary to the null hypothesis. I hope you understand the difference between null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis in detail. And that's all for today's lecture. In the next lecture we would be studying about ethics of research or research ethics, because that is a separate topic. So for that topic we would have another lecture. Still we have some time, so we can discuss about formulating the research questions. First of all, we have to understand what is formulation. Formulation means translating and transforming the selected research problems into a scientifically answerable research question. This is the aim of every study. So every study starts from formulating the research question. Here are some other concerns which we have to keep in mind while formulating research questions. In research, we formulate research questions after reviewing the literature. It enables us to communicate our ideas with others. When we formulate research questions, we are able to communicate our ideas to others through conducting the research and sharing the results and conclusion with other people. We make such research questions which may address the relationship among the variables. In quantitative research, it should identify the variables being investigated and specifically the type of relationship, whether they are descriptive or predictive or causal, what kind of relationship is found between among the variables to be investigated. So researcher has to keep all these things in mind while formulating the research questions. Research questions usually, a research problem is initially posed as a question which serves as the focus of the researcher's investigation. Research actually starts from a research question, a problem, which is a research question which is answerable, which needs an answer. So the starting point of research is formulating a research question and formulating hypothesis for your research. Research questions should specifically specify what measurable variables are included in that study, who would be the subjects and controls or participants of the study, where, the location, and how, means research design or research method, how the study would be conducted. So you have to decide all these things beforehand when you are formulating research questions. Here is a question formulation process. First of all, you have to identify a problem or issue, then define population, define interventions, comparator, outcome measure, and then you have to write questions. You have to follow all these steps. In the end, you have to write the question. Here are steps in formulation of research questions. Number 1, do not let the research question be forced upon you. Number 2, find a general area of interest, questions asked by our own students and fellows. Means if you are trying to formulate a research question on which you want to conduct a research, you should try to find the idea which is very common, which is the general problem faced by the students in our classes. Step 3, read around the topic in width or in depth, broad and extensive, not in depth, means intensive. Step 4 is identify a specific area of interest where gaps in knowledge exist, need to be filled. So you have to identify the gap. First of all, you have to find out the gap in research that you can do through reviewing the literature. And then you have to formulate your research question, which would, and the answer of that research question would fill the gap in research to some extent. It would be your contribution to the existing research. Step 5, read into the topic in depth, intensive discussion with experts in concerned field. When you are formulating research questions, you have to discuss it with the experts, so that if they suggest some amendments, you have to consider their suggestions and you have to make changes in your research questions according to the expert opinion. You may exclude some questions, or you may add some questions, or you can rephrase some questions as they suggest. Step 6, formulate a tentative research question. Then you have to formulate a tentative research question. Step 7 is evaluate the tentative research question for its suitability. Step 8 is make the research question specific. When you have made some research questions, you have to make your research questions specific. It should not be vague or general. Your research questions should be specific, means they should have only one question in one statement. There should not be double meanings. There should be no double meanings in your research questions. They should be very clear and well defined. Step 9 is write down the research question and its significance. This is the final step where you have to write down your research question and you have to keep its significance in your mind. That's all for today's lecture, and we would be studying about the details of research, formulating research questions in the next lecture. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, we can discuss those questions in the interactive online class later on. Take care. Goodbye.